in your district about ensuring that that private prison is no longer there. We have to take all of these things into consideration and look at the ways in which we have moved forward in the field of criminal justice reform in New York and know that there's still a long way to go. And so I wanted to just remind people and the new folks who may have joined, if you are on the Zoom, we are asking if you are not a panelist for you to just turn your camera off and stay muted for the duration of the town hall up until the very end before we leave. This way, when we stream it, the only people we can see are the actual panelists who will be speaking. And so before we go into the details of what Less is More New York is, and Assemblymember Anderson, you did a pretty good job of like explaining them. So it'll be an easier lift because you already explained the 30 for 30 provision and the restricting the use of incarceration. We wanted to talk about the parole system at large and really give folks an understanding of what a technical parole violation is. So I wanted to pull in two of our panelists, Kara from the Legal Aid Society and Tracy from the Little Piece of Light. So Kara, can we start with you and just have you explain the differences between probation and parole, and then dive into what a technical parole violation is and how you've seen it impact your clients?
Yes, so good evening, everybody. My name is Kara Hoffman. I am a paralegal at the Legal Aid Society, working in the Parole Revocation Defense Unit. So I work on a team of attorneys and social workers who represent clients in the parole revocation proceedings. So each and every one of our clients would be impacted by Less is More because the only cases we take are parole revocation cases. And I just want to echo so much of what Assemblymember Anderson said, that the issues that we see that our clients are facing that Less is More would help to address would help individual people and their families, but they are issues of racial equity, they're issues of socioeconomic equity, they're issues that impact folks who deal with substance abuse and mental health issues. So there's a really large, big picture aspect of this. If you are on New York State parole, it means that you have been convicted of a felony. That is the only thing all of our clients have in common. So it could be somebody's first criminal conviction. It could be their 15th. They could be serving a 3-year sentence. They could be on lifetime parole. When you come home from prison, when you are serving your parole sentence, your post-release supervision sentence, you are subject effectively to the whims of parole, your parole officer or their senior parole officer. There's a 13 standard conditions, and then depending on your particular situation, additional special conditions that people are required to adhere to. When we talk about technical parole violations, we're talking about allegations that a person on parole has not complied with one of those conditions. And I say allegations because, like both Kenyatta and Assemblymember Anderson have mentioned, that in New York State, if you are alleged to have violated one of those conditions, you are detained prior to having a hearing. So you are in New York City, you go to Rikers Island before you have seen a judge, you have met your lawyer, before you have even been presented with your charges some of the time. And so our office works with folks once they have been detained, once the parole warrant has been lodged, and we do what we can to get people back out into the communities, often reconnected with treatment, attempting to find stable housing, get folks connected with their support systems. And Less is More would be just, I mean, it's sort of hard to articulate how significant it would be. And to be very clear, parole has continued to incarcerate folks at alarmingly high rates throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Our office alone has unfortunately lost a few clients who were detained solely on technical parole violations to COVID while they were incarcerated at Rikers Island. So I just want to bring that context as well. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Kara, for sharing. And before we move on to Tracy, I just wanted to thank you for acknowledging the impact that COVID-19 has had uniquely on people who are incarcerated, and the things that we've seen and the things that we have all experienced. And so as we also acknowledge the unfortunate Black death that has happened in our country, that continues to happen, we need to keep this in mind as we push for our parole reform, because our fights are all the same fight. And so what's happening in Minnesota is the same thing that we are fighting for against here in New York. And so Tracy, I wanted to pull you into the conversation and just have you share a little bit about the importance of Less is More in New York to you, especially since not only are you a constituent of Assemblymember Anderson, but you're working with a little piece of light, and you see day in and day out women who are impacted by the criminal justice reform system, the criminal justice system. So I wanted to just bring you into the space to share your experiences and what you're seeing and why Less is More New York is important to you.
Good evening, and thank you, Kenyatta. My name is Tracy Lang. I'm with a little piece of light, President Donna Hilton. I want to thank Assembly Anderson for sharing his platform with me this evening. It's an honor to be joined with my Assembly leader of District 31 here in Queens. I'm really moved today knowing that my vote counted, my family's vote counted, the people here in District 31's vote counted. For I stand next to you, and I will say that I see all the hard work that you're putting in and the hard fight that you're putting up here in our district in Queens. Assembly Anderson, you have my support and all of the people here in District 31's support. Keep up the great work. In addition, thank you, Less is More New York, Cartel, and all of the organizations for giving me this opportunity to share my story. I was sentenced to 20 to life, 15 years into my serving my first life sentence. I was brought back into the courts to serve a second life sentence that would be ran concurrent. February 12th, 2014, I was released from Bedford Hills Correctional Facility to serve life on parole. I'm currently under the New York State parole supervision, awaiting to be released off of parole. I've been denied parole 3 times during the last 7 years of walking upright, fighting my way through the pain and the trauma that has and continues to be an impact on my life. I've maintained steady employment, no violations, complied with all mandated programs. I managed to rebuild my family. I'm a productive citizen here in Queens District 31. I participate in community give back. Today, I'm sleeping on eggshells. With these feelings, the criminal justice system has not only impacted my life, my family, although the women and family that walk in the doors of a little piece of light.
Take your time, sis.
I really appreciate you sharing your story, Tracy. Take your time. Take your time.
Again, thank you, Donna Hilton, for creating such safe space for us women and family. Yes, seeing the women like myself, broken, scared, fear with written all over their face, is more of a reason the Less is More bill being passed. Many of us on parole will be able to rest a little easier and walk less on eggshells, less worried about going back to prison for minor technical parole violations. It's not an easy walk. And that's more the reason we need this bill to be passed. Thank you.
Thank you,
so much,
Tracy.
Tracy. You said it all. And so I also want to thank you for the work that you've been doing with a little piece of light on the Less is More New York Coalition. And so since we've talked a little bit about the parole system and we've seen just a touch of how it impacts communities, I wanted to pull in Adrian from Catal just to talk a bit about the bill and its provisions. And for everybody here, look, we're all in community together. We all support each other. So take your time, man. But Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kenyatta. And Tracy, that was beautiful, beautiful testimony. So before I go into the bill and its provisions, I'd like to shed some light on why I feel passionate about this legislation. My name is Adrian Gordon. I am a member of Cattell Center for Equity, Health, and Justice. And prior to March 27, 2018, I had an amazing career as a nurse and a business owner. That all changed when I was arrested for heinous crimes I did not commit, and crimes that was later dismissed in the interest of justice. And it was dismissed only after a video the district attorney's office intentionally had surfaced, proving my innocence and proving I was the victim of a police frame-up. See, I am no stranger to the wrongful actions of law enforcement. I am no stranger to the miscarriages of justice due to systemic bias and abuse. This bill and its provisions are long overdue. I'm going to repeat that because this bill and its provisions are long overdue. So what is it and why is this bill important? I know Assemblyman touched on this earlier, so I'm going to be brief. All right. Well, the first provision of this bill will restrict the use of incarceration for most technical violations of parole. Now, I say most because there are certain technical violations that could result in jail time. However, it will be capped at 30 days. The second provision, bolstering due process. Now, what does that mean? Well, instead of an individual be detained in local jail, a person who has been accused of a technical violation would be issued a written notice of the violation along with a date that they're due to appear in court. So allow me to put some things into perspective. Imagine the hardship, the disruption that you would face if every time you received a traffic ticket, you automatically have to go to jail for up to 60 days awaiting a hearing. This is a sad reality for people on parole, and it's incredibly long for allegations. Like Kara said, these are allegations. These are not new criminal offenses. These are things that are just alleged. In addition to this provision, a person on parole who has been accused of a new criminal offense would be afforded a recognizance hearing in a local criminal court before they are detained. And the standards of bail reform statutes will apply. Now we move on to the third provision, providing speedy hearings. This will ensure that individuals under community supervision will be afforded an adjudicatory hearing upon an alleged violation of their parole. Let's take a look at how things currently work. Right now, it can take a pretty long time to get a hearing. And if someone is detained, then they're waiting days and days on end without a hearing, delaying the time that they can get out sooner. Fourth provision, providing earned time credits. See, I became familiar with this provision while incarcerated, where myself and fellow incarcerated individuals called it 30 for 30. This provision gave us hope for a better tomorrow. And what it means is for every 30 days in the community that somebody spends without violating their parole conditions, they earn a 30-day credit reduction on their overall parole time sentence. So let's say an individual is on parole for 4 years and hasn't violated for 2, and they will be free from parole according to this provision. Essentially, cutting their parole time in half and giving individuals greater incentive to follow their parole conditions. This provision is retroactive, meaning that if this bill passes, many people will be eligible to get off parole within 6 months, as long as they have been violation-free. With this provision, many people will be able to get off parole, which will have an enormous impact on the parole system in general. With a lighter caseload, an officer can dedicate more time to the individuals they do have. The cost savings would be immense. I know Assemblyman touched on this earlier, some numbers. I'm just going to say some numbers, all right? There was a recent report that came out of Columbia Justice Lab and a More Just NYC, which stated in 2019, New York State and local government collectively spent over $680 million incarcerating people for technical parole violations. The report analyzes spending at the state and county levels. Here are the findings. New York State spent $319 million in 2019 to incarcerate people for parole rule violations in state prisons. And New York City spent more than $273 million to jail people accused of technical violations. The report stated that reforms such as less is more would reduce the number of people incarcerated for parole reasons, could save significant amounts of taxpayer resources that can and should be put towards more productive uses that help people succeed when they return from prison. Now, for somebody who was wrongfully incarcerated, it's scary to know that at any given time, your rights can be swiftly taken away from you again due to a technical violation. And if this bill gets passed, I will be off parole. I'll be able to work an overnight job without fear of getting thrown into jail. I can support my family, my children, without fear. See, I've seen individuals thrown back in jail for curfew violations. I've seen people thrown in jail for drug use when it was the illegal drugs in jail that got them addicted in the first place. I've seen people thrown back in jail for mental illness. The money used to incarcerate would be more effective to rehabilitate, right? So let's restrict the use of incarceration for technical violations. Let's bolster due process. Let's provide for speedy hearings along with earned time credit. And let's do that by passing this bill, because less truly is more. Thank you.
Can I respond really quickly to Brother Avion and what he said about the fact that he can't work an overnight job?
Yes, sir.
Because he's afraid of violating the terms of his parole.
Yes, sir.
And when we talk, go ahead.
I was a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
I was a nurse before my wrongful incarceration. And part of my plea was to surrender my nursing license. So obviously I have patients that I have taken care of in the past who love me and still want me to be their nurse and want me to stay with them, but I cannot, because technically I'm not, it's not a real job. So I cannot work an overnight job. That's how my life is.
It's painful because we are removing your livelihood from you, taking that away from you, but also in speaking to what I first said when I introduced tonight's town hall, is it's cyclical, right? It's a cycle, right? These are booby traps where you trip over them and you're back in the carceral system, working in the criminal of the prison industrial complex for $2 an hour when you could be outside for less than $2 an hour, way less than $2 an hour, when you could work on the outside as a nurse, serving our community, as a frontline worker who deserves hazard pay, and that's another town hall, as opposed to be earning the slave wages that are afforded to folks who are locked up, who are in prison. So like it's a cycle. And I this is a racial equity issue for me, because you could be making more and providing more for your families on the outside than on the inside. You don't have to pay $4 for a box of cereal on the inside because the trumped up dollars amounts for the commissary, versus when you're out here being able to provide your family cheaper, more quality products you can use to support your family. This is what we talk about when we're saying racial equity. They're paying you less than $2 an hour behind bars, 60 cents probably, don't know the exact number. And then they make the rates higher for cell phones, or excuse me, for phone calls, for internet usage, for email usage. Everything is a tax to take that money that you earned back. And it's essentially a system where you're working to earn the things that you need to survive. Phone calls, family visits. These are the things that shouldn't be rewards, but should be considered also. And this is a separate piece. I'm going off into a tangent, but it's critically important. These are things that support folks and help rehabilitate folks when they're incarcerated. And so they make them an award system rather than creating a space where we're rehabilitating people, bringing them closer to their families so that they can serve out their term in a way that's dignified. So I just want to, that really hit home, Avion, when you shared your story, and Tracy also, when you shared your stories about how this criminal justice system has impacted you all individually, you not being able to work, Tracy going through all of the root of the system that is corrupt. And we've got to pass this legislation, but also look to decarcerate many aspects of the society that are, quite frankly, shouldn't be incarcerated. We should be looking to rehabilitate. And that's critically important. So I just wanted to share my 2 cents. Thank you for sharing your story, Avion, and thank you, Tracy, so very much for sharing your story as well. Sorry, Kenyatta.
Whereas the thing that I was going to say, Avion, is there's nothing else that I could say to follow that up. You said what's right, and you said what's real. And I think you really showed how insidious the system is. We shared this on the last town hall that we did with Assemblymember Ferris Hufont Forrest, and I want to share it here because Assemblymember Anderson, you alluded to it in the slave labor. Make no mistake, the criminal justice system is operating in the way that it has been designed to. It is not broken. And so it is our job to make sure that we continue to push back against these systems that oppress us, and that we make sure that we're doing things like decarcerating with bills like Less is More New York and really radically transforming the system. And to both Tracy and Avion, it is absolutely critical that y'all are here at this table. And so I appreciate all the work that y'all are doing within your respective organizations. Home court advantage because both of them are on the exec team for Less is More New York, but I just appreciate the work that y'all doing. And so I wanted to pull in Andre from the Fortune Society to talk a little bit about the ways to pass the bill. And both Legal Aid Society and the Fortune Society are members of the Less is More New York working group. And so they're working tirelessly to also pass this bill. So Andre, can you talk a little bit about why Fortune is supporting this, and then what are our next steps in order to pass it so that everyone listening on the call can take action? Now bear with us for a moment.
Yeah, apologies for that too, Kenyatta. And first, I'll say my name is Andre Ward. I'm the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. And it's really an honor to be among all of the leaders on this call today. That's each and every person that's in this box that we're looking at on this Zoom call, who represents very passionately and committedly to making sure that Less is More is passed. I want to acknowledge Assemblymember Anderson's work and his leadership and total commitment to making sure that this bill is passed. And the Fortune Society, because we serve at least over 9,000 people annually, this idea of ending the unbridled use of incarcerating people for technical parole violations for minor things, right, is something that we stand against. And we stand with Katal to make sure, and A Little Piece of Light and Unchained and others, to end this practice of sending our people back to prison for minor things, a curfew issue, an issue with substance use, as others have mentioned, issues around mental health, right? Those are things that require treatment rather than the punitive and retributive way that our country does things by incarcerating them. And when I was hearing folks share their testimony and people were talking, I know that what was mentioned was this idea around Black death. And we see what has happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and fairly recently with the young man who was killed in Minnesota. I'll maintain that the idea of, this unbridled use of incarceration for technical violations is a form of death as well, and is a threat to public safety. And the reason why I say it's a threat to public safety, because members of the public, whether people who have never been incarcerated, but especially for those who have been incarcerated, when their livelihoods are threatened by a violation, it causes death to their livelihood, especially when they're put back in prisons and jails. And so it disrupts this life that one would live of contribution. It interferes and disrupts the harmony in the household, since this person is returned and striving to do the right thing. And because of these things, Fortune stands with the Less is More bill, and it stands with the rest of the groups to ensure that this is passed. So here's some things that folks can do, just some background and context too. There are a certain number of sponsors that we currently have. We currently have in the Assembly 47 members who are co-sponsoring this bill, but we need 76 to make the majority. So we have a little ways to go. And I'm qualifying that by saying a little ways. It's not a long way. It's a little ways, but we have to push hard. And so we have 47 members in the Assembly who are currently supporting this, sponsoring this bill. We have 26 members from the Senate who are sponsoring this bill, and we need 32 to make the majority. And so, again, it's not a lot. It's a little, but it requires a lot of work on our end to get us over that threshold. The bill numbers for the Senate is S1144, and the bill number for the Assembly is A5576. In terms of the committee status itself, in the Senate, Less is More is currently in the Senate Finance Committee, which is chaired by Senator Liz Krueger, who is a co-sponsor. The bill moved out of the Crime and Victims and Crime and Corrections Committee on February 8th with a 2-4 vote. In the Assembly, Less is More is currently in the Assembly Corrections Committee, which is chaired by Assemblymember David Weprin, who also serves as a co-sponsor. The bill has not yet been placed on the committee agenda, which is something we have to continue to push as well. So some next steps. One way to pass Less is More is by getting co-sponsors. And we mentioned it earlier about current number of co-sponsors that we have, 47 in the Assembly, 26 in the Senate respectively. And we want everyone on this call to begin to do more outreach to your legislators to co-sponsor this event. This means getting 32 co-sponsors in the Senate again and 76 co-sponsors in the Assembly. Everyone on this call, I'm sure, knows 5 people. And I'm sure many of you have heard the factor of 5. If you know 5 people, then each of those individuals, they know 5 people. And can you imagine how it grows exponentially by that factor of 5? And that's one strategy that we can use to get more people to call their elected officials to join and become sponsors of the Less is More bill. The last thing, Fortune, as a part of Less is More, is working with groups and has been meeting with legislators to garner support for Less is More. So meeting with elected officials, as we said, is another way that individuals on this call can help get more co-sponsors. Today, in fact, I mentioned to Kenyatta that we at Fortune met with Senator Persaud's staff to inform her of the importance of sponsoring the bill, and it is likely that they will sponsor. And so it looks like we'll have more sponsors coming on board. But it's critically important that we all support Less is More. I served 16 years of my life in prison and was on parole for 3 years. I had supports in place. I am not the exception, but I also witnessed many others who did not have the kind of support that I had necessarily, that had some issues that needed to be addressed, not in a punitive, retributive kind of way, but in a way that required care and an alternative and an empowering environment and experience. And I know that a lot of people went back to prison just because of some of those challenges that are unique and specific to them. So please, we implore everyone on this call as leaders, thinking about the factor of 5, think about 5 people. Think about those 5 people that know 5 people that can call their elected officials to sponsor Less is More. And this is why the Fortune Society stands with Khaleel, Unchained, A Little Piece of Light, and all of you in solidarity to ensure Less is More is passed. Kenyatta?
Again, what am I supposed to follow up with that? Like, that was just on point, Andre, and I appreciated you walking through, folks, the bill numbers in both the Senate and the Assembly and how folks can take action. So we'll have a couple more action steps for folks as well, but as we come to the Q&A portion, I just want to thank our incredible lineup of speakers, including Assemblymember Khaleel M. Anderson for hosting this town hall, Tracy from A Little Piece of Light, Kara from the Legal Aid Society, Avion from the Khaleel Center for Equity, Health, and Justice, and Andre from the Fortune Society. And so we'll now open the floor if folks have any questions for our panelists. And so for the purposes of this, feel free to turn your camera on if you have a question that you would like to speak out loud, but you can also use the chat box. And if you're calling in from, and if you're tuning in from YouTube or Facebook, we'll also be monitoring the chat there so we can pull in if anybody has any questions as well. So we'll pause here and see if there are any questions for our panelists. Anthony, you want to ask one? Good to see your face, by the way.
Yeah, it's nice to be on. Yeah, I had a I was wondering, what's the best way for me to maybe sell this to people that don't necessarily like parole? You know, how would you explain this, or how would this benefit law enforcement? Because I noticed when I talk to people, sometimes if you can level with them and relate in some way, it's easier to get them involved and get them out of the negativity of, you know, some of the circumstances, you know, some of us get ourselves into.
So would any of our panelists, yeah. No, I have some ideas too about the answer for the law enforcement, but I wanted to open it to any of the panelists who wanted to ask if you have experience talking about Less is More New York with people who may not understand the parole system or be a little more hesitant to support criminal justice reform.
I'll just say quickly 2 things. One is, I think when speaking to law enforcement, right now incarceration is their only tool. Less is More would provide them with more options, because we do encounter parole officers in our work who on some level agree with us that incarceration isn't the answer, but it's the only intervention that is made available to them. And so by limiting the use of incarceration and by having hearings on the front end prior to incarceration, prior to uprooting somebody from their whole stability, their whole life, whatever they've got going on, this would flip that, right? It would flip the script. And if someone is ultimately incarcerated, it wouldn't be for up to, I saw in the chat, Anthony, 22 months on a technical violation, right? We see this day in and day out with our clients, and even clients who are ultimately revoked and restored back to the community have often done months in jail. That's time you'll never get back. You've lost your job. You've maybe lost your housing. You've been destabilized in whatever treatment you might be in, right? And so this bill would I don't mean to repeat myself, but would flip it. There'd be talking first, incarceration after, if there were incarceration at all.
And since we're coming close on the 7 o'clock hour, which I'm going to ask folks to give us some grace, we might end up going to at least 7:05. So if you got to leave at 7, don't worry, we'll follow up with some action steps. And the additional thing I wanted to add, Anthony, is when it comes to talking about how Less is More New York would impact our communities and talking specifically with law enforcement, you can also point them to our supporting letter, which we said it at the onset of this call, but we have over 250 elected officials and groups throughout the state of New York and some throughout the country who support Less is More New York. We have currently 8 district attorneys who have signed on, including Madeline Singas of Nassau County, Eric Gonzalez of Brooklyn, David Soares of Albany, Darcel Clark of the Bronx, Matthew Van Houten of Tompkins County, David Clegg of Ulster County, Mimi Roca of Westchester County. We've got 4 sheriffs who have signed on, and I won't go through reading that. Exit, which is a group of community supervision and law parole and probation members throughout the country, have endorsed Less is More New York. There are a ton of former corrections, parole, and probation commissioners who support it, and attorney generals and judges, all of which you can find on our website and on the supporting groups letter. So if anybody on this call has that experience where you're speaking directly with law enforcement who don't support the bill, easily direct them to the several law enforcement officers and folks throughout the country and state, quite frankly, who do. And so we have time for just one more question. And Professor Coffey, I see you just raised your hand, so feel free to turn your camera on and unmute, and we can get your last question in and then move to some next steps. Oh, you're on mute, Professor.
I'm very honored to be here, Kenyatta. It's great to see you. Andre, it's always a pleasure to see you and knowing you on the front line. I think that the main question that I am concerned about, particularly when it comes to parole in New York State, which I put quite a few notes in, are we the funding? Are we seeking to readdress that funding to programs such as those that of Khaleel and other agencies throughout the state, as well as addressing the culture of probation, parole offices in throughout our state? Because I do know from experience, this is where a lot of this really begins, because parole officers do have the discretion in those roles. And I do know that that is closely related to law enforcement, where it's the us versus them mentality that perpetuates this cycle of incarceration. So I am wondering, that was my greatest concern. Are we going to invest in addressing the culture within probation and parole offices across the state and readdressing how this happens?
Thank you so much, Professor Coffey. And just to let you know, at Khaleel anyway, we are not a group that runs programming in that way. We're a community organizing shop, and many of the members of and the members of the executive team as well, A Little Piece of Light and Unchained, both are community organizing shops. Although A Little Piece of Light does run programming, I'm not the complete expert, so I just wanted to clarify that. But as far as the push for ensuring that the funding is reinvested into our communities, while Less is More New York as a bill itself does not address that, that's always something that the entire Less is More New York coalition is mindful of and is purposeful in our messaging. So you even heard us on the call saying that money should absolutely be going to housing, to education, to employment. We've heard throughout this town hall in and of itself the ways in which our entire communities are impacted. So I wanted to share that while the bill itself doesn't address that, it is something that the coalition is uniquely keyed into. And as far as addressing the culture of correction officers, that is another thing that we are definitely interested in and keyed in. Again, this bill itself does not address that, but the organizations that are supporting Less is More New York, we're community-based organizations and we're organizers. So even though this particular bill may not do that, please check us out so you can stay in touch with the work that we are doing to transform the criminal justice system as a whole.
Yeah, and I'll respond to Professor Kofi too, and always good to see you as well. And thank you for your leadership and work. And, as a nonprofit organization that does do reentry services, one of the things in terms of our advocacy work is to ensure that there's a reallocation of funding away from the building up and the expansion of not only just police, but also parole and these other kind of apparatuses as it relates to engaging folk in the criminal legal system. And, this idea of the culture, I think is fundamentally important to address, like Professor Coffey is saying, because parole is an extension of policing, policing an extension of corrections. They're all like related to each other. And there's a culture and sentiment that's rooted, and let's be frank, in racism, right? And the idea of oppression. And when we look at those intersections between racism and oppression and who fall into that, which are Black and brown people in particular, we know that there has to be a complete change within the culture of each of those entities, right? Parole, probation, and correction in policing. And I think that one way we do that, obviously, is that we continue to have these conversations, but equally so be in action together with lifting that up as something that needs to change. And I know there's some organizations that are doing that now. Some nonprofit organizations that do reentry work are looking at appealing to those who they serve to join in on like changing that kind of thinking. And we're not suggesting that all police officers are a certain way, or all parole officers are a certain way, or all correctional officers are a certain way. But the culture is so deeply embedded in institutional racism that the drive is of the engagement of the people who are impacted by that is influenced by racism. And so I just wanted to kind of like offer some thoughts around that. And I know that people are working on that in their own way.
The system is racist, y'all. The only way it's not going to be that way is if we do something. So as we look to close, I just want to again say thank you to everybody who joined this town hall, and especially a big thank you to Assemblymember Khaleel M. Anderson, who is hosting this town hall. Thank you again for your continued support of Less is More New York. And it can't be understated. Again, thank you to the wonderful slate of panelists we had, including Tracy Lang from The Little Piece of Light, Adrian Gordon from the Parole Center for Equity, Health, and Justice, Kara Hoffman from the Legal Aid Society, and Andre Ward from the Fortune Society. It's always good sharing space with all of you. So I wanted to just share a couple of action steps for everyone. I know we're getting behind. It is exactly almost 7:05 on the dot, so I'm going to try and be a woman of my word and just leave everybody with some action steps. So if you're calling in from YouTube or Facebook, you won't be able to grab some of the links that I put in, but you can look them up and I'll share them out loud. So the first thing that everybody can do in order to support Less is More New York is to take and share our online action tool where you contact your lawmaker. And that gets to what Andre was sharing about meeting with legislators. And it's a great way to just email your legislator. And occasionally we have it where you can tweet at your legislator when we have our tweet storms for Less is More New York. But you want to contact your lawmaker directly and tell them why Less is More New York is important to them. The second thing that everyone can do is have your organization sign on to the list of over 250 groups and individuals throughout the state who support Less is More New York. And so you can do that from our website, and I'm dropping the link in the chat. And our website is lessismoreny.org, and I'll share that again in the chat. But adding your organization is a big help because it helps to communicate how widespread the support is for Less is More New York, and it'll let people know directly why your organization is supportive of this. The third thing that everyone can do is join us for our upcoming statewide campaign update call for Less is More New York. And so that call will be on Wednesday, April 21st from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. And give me a second, or if my colleague Yona, I'm going to pull you in if you could just drop that link in the chat for folks. But this statewide campaign update call is where everybody will be able to hear what the latest updates are for Less is More New York, similar to what Andre shared as a member of the working group. But you'll also be able to hear some different strategies that we are looking towards and things that we are doing to pass the bill, and also hear from our campaign partners. So you absolutely want to check out the statewide campaign update call. And the last thing that I want to share for everybody is we're doing days of action for Less is More New York as we head into the close of the legislative session. And so we do these days of action where we call targeted legislators in support. And if you've never been on a day of action for Less is More New York, you've got to. This morning we were playing DMX. So we just got to make sure that while we're calling targeted legislators, we're also listening to, good music to keep us pumped up. And so if you're interested in joining our day of action, our next one will be on Wednesday, April 28th from 11:30 to 1 p.m. And I'll drop the link for everyone to register. But in addition, if you're interested in hosting your own day of action, I will drop my contact information in the chat. So feel free to reach out to me at kenyatta@katalcenter.org, and we can really get it going so that you can host your own day of action. And again, to learn more and stay connected, go to lessismoreny.org, which I just dropped the link in the chat. And there you can see our latest updates, our fact sheets that get to what Avion was sharing about the incredible cost of incarceration. You'll be able to see some of our updates and press releases where you get to hear from our campaign partners. And generally, you get to stay up to date with our work. So again, thank you so much for joining us for this Less is More New York Town Hall. Do not take what you hear, do not leave what you heard here, take it with you. Like Andre said, use the power of 5, share it with people, share the online action tool, and let's stay connected, because the more we work together, the more we'll win.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kenyatta, for our brothers and sisters at the Catal Center, our brothers and sisters at Legal Aid Society and Fortune Society for being on this call tonight. Privileged to have co-hosted this important town hall tonight about the Less is More Act and what we could do to help improve the conditions of folks who are on parole. Many people falsely believe, folks, that people who are behind bars, people who are incarcerated, deserve to be there. And the reality is that we're dealing with a racist criminal and justice system that may have unjustly placed people behind bars. And there's a social contempt within our communities for people who are incarcerated. They've done something that landed them there, or they should have done it. You're there for a reason. But in all actuality, our prisons, our jails are filled with hundreds of thousands of people who are innocent or did not have an opportunity for due process, who are there. And I think someone dropped a stat in the chat. I think it was 35,000 folks are there on non-criminal technical violations. And that if we pass this bill, that's 35,000 fathers, mothers, sisters, daughters, brothers that would have the right to due process, that would have their case seen and heard in a just process and in a speedy way if we pass this bill.
And the only clarification, there are 35,000 people on active parole supervision, 5,000 people currently incarcerated throughout New York State prisons and jails for technical parole violations. I just didn't want people to leave thinking it was 35 for technical.
Yes. Good. Thank you for that friendly amendment. Critically important. Just as I close, I want to reiterate that the prisons and jails that exist across the state should be rehabilitative. There should not be landmines everywhere. People should not be walking on eggshells, particularly if the system is supposed to, quote unquote, rehabilitate folks, right? We shouldn't be overly punishing folks. And that's what we're seeing in this system. So I'm grateful for this bill. I'm grateful for your leadership, Tracy. I'm grateful for your heart and ability to share your story. Avion, I'm grateful for you, brother, for going around the state to share your story and to allow people to hear your struggles so that we can be more effective legislators and our communities can be more effectively educated on these things. When you hear the words criminal justice reform, parole reform, sometimes you scare the hell out of people. But when you actually read what we're trying to do, when you actually study and hear the stories and listen to people who struggle through this system, you understand that we have to right size a ship that has capsized onto our communities and that has harmed us for decades. So I'm appreciative. I'm glad. I also have to throw in a plug and thank my colleague, Farah Soufran-Forrest of the 57th District in Brooklyn, who's carrying this legislation in the Assembly. Also have to shout out my Senate colleague, Brian Benjamin, who's carrying this bill in the Senate. Let's get this thing passed and let's right size this capsized ship. Thank you very much. Peace, folks.
Thank you.